The next stop is Avenue J.
Because controversy always draws a crowd, I'm assuredly the right person to not give these lectures, so that way you know that they won't be too controversial. The Rambam, about whom we'll hear much tonight, was certainly at the heart of some of the most interesting of controversies, many of them that pursued him literally to the grave and thereafter. In Moreh Nevuchim says, to paraphrase and translate it into English, truth does not become more true by virtue of the fact that the entire world believes in it or agrees with it.
Thank you.
Nor less so, even if the whole world disagrees with it. And the Rambam, therefore, was one who, with his great intellect, devotion to Torah and to truth, said and taught much that many of his time and then thereafter had a great deal to say criticism of. We'll hear more about this tonight from a very special friend of ours who we have no criticism of at all. Dr. Abramson, my good friend Rav Hillel, is a native of Northern Ontario, Canada. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto and has held postdoctoral appointments at Harvard, Cornell, Oxford, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's authored numerous books, including Prayer for the Government, Ukrainians and Jews in Revolutionary Times, and an interesting book about Talmud Torah, reading the Talmud, developing independence in Gemara learning, and other books. Many scholarly articles. His research has been recognized with prestigious fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. He's a sought-after lecturer. He's addressed audiences in the Far East, here, in Eretz Yisrael, in Europe, across America and Canada. He's appeared in 2 documentary videos, and we're very proud that he is a member of our shul and one who has graciously consented to add so beautifully to our adult ed program. Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Hillel Abramson.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Point of a clarification before we begin. I'm not a rabbi. That allows me considerable freedoms with what comments I might make. I have to say that I've been looking forward to this talk for a few weeks since the Rav invited me to speak here, because I have been enjoying participating in the minyanim and the programs of this fine institution, enjoying the words of wisdom of the rabbis. But that all changed about 10 minutes ago when Rabbi Beryl Wine walked in the room. And at that point, my blood pressure dropped, and I realized that it's completely inappropriate for me to speak about something even so basic a topic as the Maimonidean controversy when we are in the presence of one of the greatest Jewish historians of the 20th century, someone whose popularization of Jewish history and its consequent impact on Jews around the world rivals and in many ways exceeds the literary output of greats like Heinrich Gretz and Salo Baron, Shimon Dubno, the great encyclopedic historians of the last 150 years, and is with great trepidation and with the reshus of the Rabbanim and Rabbi Wine that I offer this very basic introduction to the Maimonidean controversy. I beg of you, please don't ask any hard questions, but perhaps Rabbi Wine will address those that fall into the large lacuna of my knowledge base. Okay, that said, I will try to ignore the fact that he is in the room and just speak like it's a normal class of adult ed. I'm very grateful for the warm introduction. My goal tonight, as I discussed with Rabbi Teitelbaum, the best sort of series to start with in this audience is to begin a study of spiritual leadership in times of controversy. And we're going to start on a slow slope with Maimonides. We do have a couple of nasty elements in this story, a rather sad book burning and a grave desecration, for example. But we're going to ramp up considerably when we meet on the 30th, God willing, to speak about the Ramchal and the legacy of Shabbatai Tzvi. Unlike today's lecture, which is basically, this is a route that has been traveled by many historians. Next week, or next time we meet on the 30th, I'm hoping to share with you some recent research which sheds some fascinating insights into the background and the development of the controversy surrounding the Ramchal. And then finally, when we meet in early December, we'll speak about Rav Kook and some of the controversies that surrounded the establishment of the State of Israel and the reimagining of the relationship between Jews and politics that occurred in the middle of the 20th century. So those are my goals for this series. We're going to start with Maimonides. Let's get right to the material. I already received an introduction, but perhaps I should just say a little bit about myself. This is, you can read the caption. Okay, thank you. I will boost up the laugh track when I actually put this on the web. I'm a historian by training. As the rabbi mentioned, I did my specialization in social history in 20th century Ukraine. And then I moved into art history. I published a small book on the iconography of the medieval period and the representation of Jews. And then since then, I've been working in intellectual history for the most part. My current research is on the Piaseczna Rebbe, where I'm working on a historical critical annotated edition of the Eish Kodesh, really more of a monograph than an annotated edition, but I think perhaps in another occasion I'll speak to you more about that. My current position is I'm dean at the mighty Avenue J campus of Touro College, shown here in its majesty in the heart of Brooklyn, where undoubtedly you will send all of your children and grandchildren and relatives. Okay, so let's start with just a very brief biography of Maimonides, enough to give us kind of a Vorspeise, a sense of who this individual was, and then we will go into the controversy surrounding him in a little bit more detail. This is a statue which was erected of him in Cordoba, Spain, by a grateful Spanish people long after they had evicted him and the Jews, of course, but nevertheless a fitting and graceful reminder of who this giant among giants was. He came from a long line of rabbinic progenitors. He lists in his commentary in the Mishnah 8 generations of Dayanim that preceded him, and he grew up, his early childhood was when this part of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim rule. Unfortunately for the Maimonides family, the Almohads took over and spread their influence throughout both North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. And the Almohads were famous for their rather strict interpretation of Sharia, which revised the dhimmi status of Jews, meaning Jews were a protected people since the Pact of Umar in the 8th century, where in exchange for certain second-class rights, like paying double taxes and so on, and certain symbolic gestures, like not being allowed to bear arms and so on, they were tolerated within Muslim societies. The Almohads took a much stricter view of these things, and the Maimonides family was forced to flee. Their route took them across the coast of North Africa. I'll show you some beautiful pictures here. You can see some of these things. In 1148, when he was about in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 years old. Here's his birthplace in Cordoba, Spain. He's received quite a bit of training, particularly medical training, as they were wandering over 9 years in the city of Fez, which was a major center at that time. There's some discussion over his arrival in Israel, but he settled ultimately in Fustat, which is a small suburb outside of Cairo. And that's where he made his home. But his claim to fame really came when he left his sort of narrow bookish studies and had to enter the wider world, primarily as a medical physician. As we shall see, a very prominent element of his thought, the Maimonidean position vis-a-vis rabbinic work is that it should be entirely gratis, that the people who earn their living through the production of Torah scholarship or the dissemination of Torah should not be paid directly for engaging in such work. They obviously have an obligation to share their wisdom and to teach Torah, but it should ultimately be completely free. And so those 8 generations of Dayanim that preceded Maimonides held fast to this truism, and Maimonides had to seek a career, particularly when he was orphaned by his father, and his brother, who supported the family as a jewel merchant, drowned in a shipping accident. So Maimonides had to turn to a career, and of course he chose the good Jewish profession of medicine. He turned out to be quite a brilliant physician. He ended up being the court physician of the Grand Vizier in Cairo, and he made his way every day from Fustat to Cairo to treat particularly the many wives of the Grand Vizier and their children, and then he would come back late at night. He describes it in his writings, and he would give halachic decisions quite late into the evening, and he would finally collapse exhausted in his bed long after midnight. He was sought after by Saladin the Great, the important Muslim leader of the region, and according to some rumors, even Richard the Lionheart from England courted the idea of appointing Maimonides as his physician. That did not come to pass, but it gives you a sense of what kind of reputation he had. We will not spend much time talking about his medical expertise, but it is really quite fascinating. He was very widely published in Arabic. He wrote treatises on hemorrhoids, on asthma, on sexual dysfunction. Most of this was written on commission. Various members of the Muslim nobility requested these various medicinal treatises, and he complied happily and produced quite a significant body of medieval research, heavily dependent on the classical wisdom of the Greeks and Romans. His perhaps most famous contribution to the world of medicine was a quadrilingual dictionary of medicinal herbs and plants, which essentially brought together in a phenomenal tour de force of scholarship, which was so uniquely Maimonidean in its encyclopedic scope. He was able to bring together 4 distinct languages and the terminologies for very specific herbs and other medicinal plants and so on, and describe their uses, how they're found, how the treatment works, and so on. Really quite an amazing achievement of its time. Now, but he also wrote on depression as well. And we spoke a little bit about his daily commute. These are all, by the way, various medieval representations of Maimonides that I like to show up. We don't really know what he looks like, despite that iconic image with the turban and so on. We really have no idea what he looks like. This is, however, some of his autograph manuscript, which was preserved in the Geniza archive, so we do know a little bit about what he wrote like. Now, his works on the Jewish side of his life, and it might not be appropriate to bifurcate his life in that regard, but let's work with that for the time being, can be divided into 2 main areas of scholarly activity. And this is what really engendered much of the controversies that we will explore. The first is a series of very popular halachic works, which got him into more trouble than you can imagine. Basically, he wrote works like the Sefer HaMitzvot, which is essentially a counting of the 613 mitzvot. He wrote the commentary on the Mishnah at a very young age, not as young as some biographies would have him write it, like when he was 8 or 10, most likely closer to his early 20s, but nevertheless a very mature work of scholarship for a man who was barely into his 3rd decade. And most famously, the massive and earth-shattering Mishnah Torah, which we will have to pause on later and speak about in greater detail. But this is essentially a multiple-volume compendium of all Jewish law. It was a phenomenal achievement for the time. The other body of works that occupied his energy were advanced philosophical works, mostly written in Judeo-Arabic, which was the lingua franca for the Jews, the vernacular for Jews at that time. And these were much more complex philosophical works. The Guide for the Perplexed is certainly the most well-known of them, in which he works with Aristotelian philosophy and Jewish thought and brings together a synthesis. That's a very loaded word that, as we shall see shortly. But these are the two main areas in which he devoted his pen, and as we shall see, he got in a tremendous amount of trouble for both of them. And so let us now turn to the controversies itself. This picture here, which is one of the best-known examples we have of a period piece of a book burning, is actually not a representation of the burning of Maimonides that occurred in the early 13th century, but it is nevertheless very colorful. It's actually a Christian book burning of other Christian books, so I just liked it, so I used it there. Okay, so let's look. The controversy about Maimonides really can be broken down into four main periods. And scholars of the Maimonidean controversy emphasize that there's a lot of overlap between the four periods, and in the major charges, we can trace certain themes that are related to the dissemination of his writings in Hebrew, because, for example, the Guide being written in Judeo-Arabic was inaccessible to the scholars of Europe, but once the Ibn Tibbon family and others translated it into Hebrew, then all of a sudden his more controversial works were accessible, and of course a new generation of critics of Maimonides arose already 3 decades after his death. But for the most part, many of the themes that are present in the first element of controversy extend through the fourth and even up until the 21st century, and we're just going to put them into 4 basic groupings for our purposes. So the first period occurred in Maimonides' own lifetime, during the last 2 decades of his life. The main controversy, it was really centered in his home region and then spread to south of France in particular, and it really addressed something that I mentioned earlier. First of all, let's look at the Mishneh Torah. What exactly is the Mishneh Torah? If you read the introduction to that massive work, which I highly encourage you to do so, Maimonides essentially says that the reason he called this book the Mishneh Torah, which means the repetition of Torah, is because he took the entire corpus of Jewish thought as written in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Mishnah, and especially the sweeping and, it's hard to find the right word to describe what the Talmud is. I'm sure most of you have had some familiarity with the Talmud as a text, but to be fair, let me just describe to you that the Talmud is not a Greek-style book. It doesn't start with, organized chapter headings and proceed from general to specific. It doesn't have, numbered paragraphs. It doesn't have any of the trappings of Western scholarship that we have come to know and love, really, since our primary school days in the Western Hemisphere. The Talmud is more like a massive transcript of a very learned discussion involving hundreds of people over several centuries. In other words, the Talmud might start in a particular place, but through a fascinating kind of chain of association, kind of a stream of consciousness, the discussion of Talmud can wander from the, let's say we're talking about the laws of carrying on Shabbat, and then you can go over here to, animals. Are they exempt from carrying? And from talking about animals exempt, then you talk about the behavior of a cat and what we can learn from it. And it goes, you can go into massive tangents. In fact, tangents describe the Talmud more than anything else. It is a science unto itself just to draw the dots between each of the various statements in the Talmud. And what that means is, in terms of accessibility, forget about it. If you want to know a law quickly, you cannot simply open up the right page of the Talmud and there is the law. It could be scattered anywhere within the entire massive 20-volume set of the Babylonian Talmud, and you have to have already studied the whole thing to know where to look. So this kind of document, which was, as some scholars have called it, the Constitution of Judaism, requires phenomenal experience and training just to access it and work with it. Maybe I'll just pause for a second here. I want to develop a talk for posterity. I know most of you in this room, I see Mr. Friedman here, you might not get this, but you'll catch up with me. We're living in a very unusual age, and it's ironic that Maimonides mirrors this in many ways. We are living in an age, forgive me for this slight digression, we're living in an age where the internet has shifted our learning from that of gathering information to collecting wisdom. And it's a very, very significant shift that most young people, like Mr. Friedman here, have no clue that this happened. Like, let me explain to you, Mr. Friedman. For example, when I was in graduate school to get my PhD, they gave me points just for trying hard. Like, for example, if I wanted to know a fact, there was no cell phones to, like, immediately Google any fact in the universe, right? There was no hive mind. I had to go into this big building, which is called a library. Thank you, library. And then they had these little narrow file cabinets that were filled with little tiny index cards, physical index cards. And I had to, like, use my fingers and go through all of them. Once I dropped one of them, and hundreds of them spread all over the floor. They were in alphabetical order, so that meant that most of those books would never be found for a decade. And you had to find the right card catalog, and then you had to read the number and go physically to that book in the library. You had to take it off the shelf. You had to read it. And if it was in a different language, you had to learn that language. And if it was in a different country, you had to go to that country. It was like, and they figured by the time you got any fact, they said, okay, you worked hard enough, give them the doctorate already. But nowadays, we live in an age where so much, I mean, my students know far more facts than I do just on their phones, but they do not have the accumulation of wisdom. You can have millions of facts and still not have any seichel. So Maimonides essentially, you know, he took the Talmud, which required a phenomenal amount of seichel, a phenomenal amount of accumulation of energy to be able to use a kind of an enthalpic process and bring all that stuff together in a human being, and he laid it out in a much more Greek style, fashioned after some of the Arabic style that of Kalam, which was pioneered by Saadia Gaon in the Jewish context, and simply said, okay, in these 14 books, we are going to go through every single law in the entire Torah in a systematic way. Here are the chapters. This is what's in each chapter. Here's the numbered paragraphs, and you can use it like a smartphone. Just think of that. The Mishnah Torah was like the smartphone of his day. Okay, enough background on why this was a radically new document for Jews. We never had anything even remotely like it before Maimonides. It was truly revolutionary and earth-shattering in its scope. But it had a phenomenal economic element to it. Because what does this mean? When you have a book of this nature, what happens to the industry of rabbinic instruction? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
Same thing that happens when you replace the Vilna Shas with Art Scroll.
Almost. It's much bigger, I think, than replacing the Vilna Shas with Art Scroll. The Art Scroll at least allows much more accessibility. I think it's more like replacing the Vilna Shas with the Bar Ilan project, where all of a sudden anybody and his brother knows every single reference to tuna fish in the entire 3,000 years of Jewish literary tradition, whereas before it would take you a Gaon of incredible portions just to know 10 references to tuna fish, right? And there are references I can think of. So in other words, the rabbis, particularly those in Babylon, in the Gaonic institutions, were very threatened by Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. They felt that not only did it represent a tremendous arrogance to say, I am going to repeat the entire Torah in one book, and essentially, together with the 5 books of Moses, this is all you need. This is like, the Mishnah Torah was like a complete revolution, and you add that to the fact that Maimonides criticized the economic mainstay of the rabbis, saying, why are you doing this for money? Then the Babylonian rabbis felt very threatened. Maimonides, by the way, did not suffer from hesitancy when it came to criticizing his intellectual opponents. And he spoke his mind very clearly. So some which would ironically, Mida Keneged Mida, he would later find in some of his critics. But the Gaon Shmuel ben Ali, for example, took tremendous issue with Maimonides, accusing him of tremendous arrogance by creating this book, by saying that people are now going to abandon their rabbis because they're just going to use their Mishnah Torah, and life as we know it will cease, and people, ignorance will spread, and people will be breaking the halakha all over the place because they will think they don't need to go to a rabbi anymore. Ironically, by making information more democratic and more accessible, it increased the amount of learning overall, and now the Mishnah Torah is a central part of any Jewish library. He was also criticized, however, because he did not include source material in his Mishnah Torah. The Talmud is full of debates, full of disagreements, and it's very difficult to determine from the text of the Talmud itself what exactly is the final conclusion, what is the law. So Maimonides did not include the background as to why he agreed with one rabbi as opposed to another. He simply said the halacha is like this, and so if you happen to feel that the halakha should follow another rabbi, there was no way to fact check him. There was no way to run it down and say, well, what's your logic to say we should agree with Rava instead of Abaye in this particular situation? So he was criticized once again for arrogance in the sense that his literary style, which favored simplicity. You don't want to overburden the book with footnotes. Of course, one of the very first things rabbis did as soon as this came out is they started adding more and more footnotes. The Shulchan Aruch himself, Rabbi Yosef Karo, added a massive footnote, the Kesef Mishnah. When his work reached Europe, he was also criticized quite bitterly by the Ravad, a very, very important rabbi who would not hold back in his extreme criticism, often ad hominem criticism of Maimonides, which is, and I think this is a beautiful aspect of the Jewish tradition, the Ravad is printed right there, front and center, on every page of the Mishnah Torah. So Jews typically read dispute as part of the central text. We do not, send the dispute way off to some other little notebook on another side of the library. It's right there on the text itself. Once the Guide for the Perplexed was translated into Hebrew, as I mentioned, then the criticisms expanded still further, but this is, sorry, I'm getting my reminders up here. This is the kind of controversy that surrounded him. All right, you're going to see probably Call Mum will come up soon. I didn't call her yet today. But this is what the main areas in which he was criticized during his lifetime. We move to the second period, and now it moves into France, or Provence to be precise, where it's not so much the Mishnah Torah and its style and its claim for its universal nature, because by this point, already 50 years into its appearance, the genius of the Mishnah Torah was widely accepted. Now the criticism tended to revolve around Maimonides' heavy reliance on Aristotle in particular and Greek philosophy in general. The Europeans, by and large, were much more inclined towards mysticism, Kabbalah, much less well-trained in the school of thought that came from classical Greece and Rome, primarily because this was an occupation of the Muslim world. Quite often, Arabs were reading versions of Aristotle and so on that had been translated by Jews. But in Christian Europe, this was not the case, and so there was much more hesitancy about Maimonides' heavily reliance on these philosophical sources. And there was a very deep debate, which persists to this day, as to what degree is philosophy, that is, the rational, logical, empirical approach to reality, compatible with a faith-based religion, the idea of emunah. Can you have emunah and philosophy in the same faith. The church was very heavily weighted against the rationalist views of the time, issuing several bans against Aristotle, for example. And as I'm sure you've heard the expression, as es christelt sich, es jiddelt sich, Jews tend to follow the tenor of the times, and so the Christian ban on philosophy sort of flowed over into the Jewish world against Maimonides. Rabbeinu Yonah, the famous author of the Sharei Tshuva, and many other figures, Nachmanides, took quite an issue with the guide, and they tended to focus on three major areas of criticism. The first, arguing that Maimonides denied the possibility of the miraculous, because that tends to be an anti-rationalist stance. If God made the world in a rational fashion, it should follow rational laws throughout, without any need for change. In fact, the change represented by a miracle indicates somehow a defect in God's own function, as it were. Second, the allegorization of Scripture, that the various anthropomorphisms that you find in the Torah tend to be dealt with quite often on a symbolic level by Maimonides. And finally, an assertion that with this kind of approach that seems to rely more on the mind than on the heart, it will result in a laxity in observance. So there were some defenders, such as the famous Rav David Chimchi, the Radak, but the controversy swirled to such a point that in 1232, shockingly, the Dominicans, the Dominican friars, set Maimonides' works aflame. There's a certain amount of dispute as to exactly why they were motivated to do so. Many scholars have argued that the Jews denounced Maimonides to the Dominicans, who were very happy to comply by burning Maimonides themselves. And as I believe I heard Rabbi Wein say in one of his tapes many, many years ago, the spot where the Dominicans burned the Maimonides 10 years later would be the exact spot in Paris where 24 wagon loads of Talmud were burned as well. Rabbi Wein, if I'm quoting you incorrectly, please don't say so. It will embarrass me terribly. Yeah. Now, and also, amazingly, the Rambam's own grave was desecrated at this time by his opponents. Terrible, terrible shanda and a horrible chil Hashem. Maimonides' son, who incidentally differed with his father on many areas. As much as Maimonides himself was a rationalist, his son Abraham was actually a mystic and very much into Abalafi and Kabbalah, nevertheless defended his father with tremendous vigor and commitment, and put to shame many of the opponents of the Rambam. But this is perhaps the sharpest point of the controversy surrounding his works. The third period is much less significant later on in the 13th century and centered in Israel by an unfortunately named Rabbi Shlomo Petit. That's a French word, of course, meaning small. It also, in Hebrew, Petit means idiot or fool, and many of the defenders of Maimonides would use this rhetorically against him, but also also circulated criticisms of Maimonides' excessive reliance on Greek wisdom, which did not have much of an impact. But the fourth period, which is perhaps the most significant for our times, which goes into the early 14th century, at this point, the idea of a synthesis, the idea of somehow the possibility of Judaism meeting with a rational standard, meaning you could use a philosophical ruler or yardstick to understand the basic tenets of Judaism, this was a less controversial position. However, there were nevertheless still quite significant fears that should young Jewish boys leave the Beis Medrash to explore the thought of people like Aristotle or perhaps even Plato, that would prove to be such a heady mixture of a new way of thinking that would result in abandonment of Judaism. And there are some good reasons to argue that this isn't the case. This is, in fact, the reality. The end result of the controversy swirling around Maimonides at this point was in 1305, the great Rishon Rashba issued a ban which had a limited scope, indicating that young men under the age of 25 should not be allowed to study philosophy. There were a couple of exceptions. For example, they were allowed to study medicinal works. Medicine, at this point, the distinction between philosophy and science was not so well developed. So the idea of studying medicine, even if it had philosophical origins, was all right. And furthermore, Jewish philosophers, like early art scroll publications of the 14th century, were also considered kosher substitutes. Many scholars of the time, however, opposed the ban, including the great Rishon, the Meiri, so it was far from a settled field. Nevertheless, this quick overview takes you through some of the major elements of the Maimonidean controversy during his lifetime. Let's wrap it up by moving to two more modern iterations of this controversy. The first, and it arises from time to time throughout the Middle Ages, but it becomes significant once again once you get to the 18th century, when Moses Mendelssohn, shown here, argued more forcefully than ever that it was possible to somehow create, this word synthesis, to bring together, European wisdom, which is essentially the Greco-Roman tradition, and Judaism. To use the words of Gordon, to be a Jew at home and a man in the street, that somehow Jews should be able to participate in the wider circles of non-Jewish culture, that it should not be regarded as fundamentally toxic to the ethos of Judaism. And the supreme role model of all these things is undoubtedly Maimonides, who was a great scholar of medicine of his day, and at the same time, a tremendous authority in Judaism. And these two combinations, you have occasionally great rabbis who are also fairly successful in secular fields. And of course, we have many Jews who are incredibly successful in secular fields, but don't know very much about Judaism. Maimonides was one of those really unusual, shooting stars across the firmament that represented the best of both worldly wisdom and secular wisdom. And so Maimonides, and all he stood for, was touted as the ideal goal for Jews of the modern age. Of course, Mendelssohn was a controversial figure unto himself, and many felt that his understanding of Judaism and the relationship of Jews to modernity was ultimately an assimilationist ideology that would result in a wholesale abandonment of Judaism. And it doesn't take much familiarity with the 19th and 20th century in Germany to see how, in fact, the idea of a synthesis was largely a myth, and as hard as the Jews worked towards such a marriage between Jewish culture and German culture, and succeeded in many ways, they were nevertheless unable to stem the tide of anti-Semitism that would engulf the region in the 20th century. Finally, the last expression of this conflict is in our own days, under the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe, shown here, who renewed a tremendous emphasis and interest in Maimonides among his massive and growing group of dedicated followers. For those of you who might not be familiar with it, Chabad typically assigns a role to the Mishnah Torah that's second only to the Talmud in its importance. And the very dedicated Chabad Hasidim will actually study the entire Mishnah Torah on a yearly or triennial cycle. And I once actually spoke to a Chabad friend of mine, and I said, it's kind of an impressive thing to study and we're talking now not about Daf Yomi, which is essentially one folio page. We're talking about reading 3 chapters of the Mishnah Torah every day for an entire year. I said, that's a pretty impressive thing. He says, it's nice to, quote unquote, learn the entire Torah, isn't it? So in other words, my Chabad friend really absorbed Maimonides' own self-assessment of the Mishnah Torah really being the entire Torah, just written in this very different format. Other rabbinical figures who took issue with the Lubavitch movement for several reasons also took issue with this heavy emphasis on the Mishnah Torah, which they felt would dilute energies that could have been directed to perhaps more traditional intellectual pursuits like the study of the Talmud. But with that, we can conclude by speaking briefly about Maimonides' legacy. I think what I'm reminded of is the passage in Pirkei Avot that says that, any machlokas that is, l'shem shamayim will ultimately endure. Any machlokas that is altruistic in nature will ultimately endure. And we see that Maimonides' works continue to have an evergreen quality to them, that they are continually fresh and read with tremendous impact even now in the 21st century. And yet the controversy that swirls around them, although perhaps not as intense or as focused as it was in the 13th century, nevertheless is something that exists with us to this day. And with that, I conclude the first lecture. I hope you found it interesting. I thank you very much for your endurance and your patience, and I'll hang around for some questions if you like. Okay, nobody likes to ask the first question, so we can start with the second question if you prefer. Should I tell you? Yes, please.
Was there anybody who was critical of the content? In other words, Rambam holds, that this is Basar and Kala, and that somebody says, no, he's wrong. Halachically, he's wrong. Did anyone criticize the content in terms of halacha?
Absolutely. On specific issues, you'll find them on every page of Mishnah Torah. And quite often, as I don't want to teach Torah in front of the Rabbanim, but it's a historical fact that we often don't paskin like the Rambam, that we hold a totally different opinion. Where the controversy was especially sharp tended to be in the philosophical areas. For example, his discussion of the life after death was especially controversial. Many felt that his writings assailed the traditional notion of a physical resurrection of the body, because he tends to focus on the life of the mind, the resurrection of the spirit, enjoying the ziv shechina, things like that. And many said, well, look at all these passages we have that really emphasize physical revival of the dead. But he did address that in a later writing, so that controversy calmed down a little bit during his lifetime. But definitely, halachically, there are so many disagreements with many of his opinions. And the fact that he didn't provide footnotes kind of leaves him open to criticism as well. That was a good question. I'm glad you asked that. It wasn't too hard. It's kind of like in my wheelhouse. Okay. All right, thank you very much for coming. I hope you have a good evening.
I have a question, but
Sure.
I don't know.
Hello. I hope you enjoyed that lecture as much as I enjoyed delivering it. It was a really fantastic audience, and I had a great time speaking about the Rambam, one of my favorite characters in the long and complex history of the Jewish people. I'm especially fascinated by his very principled stand that Torah should be free, that people who teach Torah, people that produce Torah scholarship, should be doing it without any direct compensation for their work. Obviously, we have to find ways to employ our professional Torah teachers, because otherwise they would, have to take other types of occupations to support themselves and their family, and we really want to make them free so that they can engage in the study of Torah and in the teaching of Torah as well. But I love the idea that it's something that should just be available to the entire globe, simply as a resource. And it motivates me when I produce these videos, because I'm so glad that so many people around the world are able to enjoy them. I hope that you're among them. Mind you, if you're watching this video at the very end of that long lecture, you probably are. However, and here's the pitch, we have a lot of undergraduate students here at Touro College, and college is expensive, particularly when they're engaged in very advanced study at the tertiary level. I want to do everything I can to make it possible for them to achieve their career and professional objectives. So if you're motivated by these videos and you have the wherewithal to help financially, then please click on that little I in the corner or email me, and you can donate to one of two causes that are very close to my heart. One is the Avenue J Scholarship Fund, which is directed specifically to the students we have here on campus to make it possible for them to study without worrying about their tuition obligations. And the second one is the Friends of Jewish History, which is a much smaller fund that is designed specifically to support the public lectures and the videos that you're enjoying. So it would be great if you chose either of those. If your personal situation doesn't permit you to help in that regard, then just, share this video. Let's spread this around. Let's take the Rambam's example and try and make for ourselves a better world by sharing information that is useful and uplifting. Okay, I hope that wasn't too much. I hope to see you in person, perhaps in some of the lectures, or at least virtually on the screen.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.